Well, no, I'm gonna. Is any. So I think that's the better.
And it's in the archives. So
Correct.
We just ask people.
Yes. You have a different opinion? No. Richard, do you have a concern?
All right, we are right at the start time. Got a few people filtering in. If they can filter in and get settled, we're going to try to get started.
You agreed to take minutes.
No keeping quiet.
If you're willing to, that saves us a little bit of startup time. So we had a volunteered meeting minute taker. Could I get a second person that would be willing to back Eric up if Eric finds himself at the mic?
What do you mean?
I'm gonna have to twist some arms if I don't get a volunteer. Steve, is there any way I can twist your arm to just capture the minutes if you see that Eric is in a position where he can't? All right, I appreciate it. Do I have a volunteer for a Jabber scribe? Anybody? I'm not going to twist arms on this one, but it would sure be nice if we had somebody. Just to relay, thank you. All right, so before we get started, we have an organization here that is interested in capturing a quality video recording of what we're doing as part of a campaign that they are working on addressing the robocalling issue. Is there anyone in the room that has any objection whatsoever to this session being recorded this way?
So that was my first question. What's the name of the organization? And second, I have no problem if they want to record it, long as they're aware that like this is a work in progress. So like what we decide gets decided on the list. That what we discuss here isn't like set in stone, and they can run away and beat us up later about it.
Would you like to come to the mic and answer those questions? And my concern actually is and you can answer this as well, what the purpose of the recording is and how it will be used.
So yes, we understand that this is all a discussion of frameworks and drafts, and that you all are kind of the important people working on building the future, and we are completely within that context. As to how it will be used, honestly, I don't 100% know. We're filming this because we're new. We're Consumers Union, the nonprofit publisher of Consumer Reports. We have just launched a campaign on robocalls, and we are learning about you all and about the issue, and so that's it. Are we going to use it to slam anybody? Absolutely not. No one is, there's no intention here to have anything other than an interesting experience and some recording of it.
So, we're going to say no if any single individual has a concern. Does any individual have a concern? Okay.
Mark's saying that's because he didn't hear the first part of the question.
Well, that's because he wasn't in the room.
No problem. Well, then everybody else will have problems.
The irony if we decided no to this but fine to the Macheco stuff would just leave me.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're going to start into the session. We are operating under the note well. If you're not familiar with this, you should very quickly go get familiar with it. Here's our agenda today. We're going to spend a few minutes on this administrivia, then we have some proposed liaison responses that Richard's going to walk us through, or is John going to do that? Then we'll talk about 4474 bis and then about certificates. Anybody have any bashes to that agenda? All right, just before we jump in, Richard, if I could borrow you for a moment. As our outgoing AD from a working group that has brought in architectural constraints and perhaps protocol elements that are a little bit unusual, we thought we would hand you a wine that has a little bit of unusual. From the Big Island of Hawaii, mixed with some interesting South American berries.
That's me.
Thank you for your time helping us move along.
Thank you very much, Richard.
All right, John, if you can come start getting attached to the microphone. If you would all, please go to the groups list and find the proposed text that we have for these liaison statement responses. You'll want to see those because what I'm going to put on the screen will be helpful, but it's a lot of words and getting them all on the screen at the same time is very, very difficult.
Yeah, one wonders how productive necessarily a discussion of liaison text we're going to submit necessarily could be, but this has gone out to the list, and really I think we should view this as an opportunity. People have read it, you're reading it right now on your laptop, you see an issue, let us know. There's 2 of these that we need to go through, and good. It is late in the week. We are getting down. I have actually really nothing to do after this. This is pretty much the end of my responsibilities this week, so I think this is actually quite fitting. As this scrolls by and you all learn what happened, it was actually a kind of long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Hawaii is pretty far from here, but actually we discussed what we do about these 2 distinct liaisons. Now this one is which? That's scrolling by now. This is the XTICSC one?
Well, they're both. That remains. This one. This will help you out.
It'll help me out in the sense that
PICSC on the technical measures, mechanism of countering the spoof call. I mean, I can put static text
I
up here if you
can
want.
speak to it. It's fine. So I mean, I view this first liaison actually as being an example of a request for information. There's new work that's being started in the ITUT. I believe this one was also in 17. that was specific to the VoLTE network, that was looking at anti-spam technologies. And I think they were really asking kind of more about the applicability of STIR, what parts we thought we were covering versus not covering. And so our response to this is very much, we do think we're addressing this. Here's some of our art that you can look at and kind of understand where we're coming from. We don't think that there's necessarily a big conflict here in the scope.
On the list.
I think in our responses to both of these, obviously, the IETF's slightly different mandate to examine the internet broadly and the way that this technology is going to be used, for a pure technology like SIF, as opposed to in any particular deployment environment like the IMS, like VoLTE, what have you, gives us, unfortunately, more we need to look at to make sense of this. So, Mr. Daly, you're already getting up to object to. Could you read that as it went by, or are you just looking at it in the list?
I'm just listening to your kind words, sir. Martin Daly. Well, no, but it's not even the ITU should not be doing anything in IMS or VoLTE. That's 3GPP. So the fact that there's parallel work being done, considering the fact that within 3GPP SA1 and 3GPP SA3, where they do security, there is study activities on, including, anti-spoofing type capabilities, building off of STIR, not reinventing the wheel, building off of STIR into 3GPP specifications.
Martin, before you sit down, I totally agree with what you said. The question is whether the liaison from this working group is the one that should say that.
Okay, it wouldn't hurt to have a statement saying, and by the way, if you are trying to support anti-spoofing capabilities, that 3GPP would be a more appropriate form. Okay, maybe not tell them that 3GPP is more appropriate, but maybe just highlight. And by the way, are you aware that 3GPP is currently working on supporting anti-spoofing capabilities, building off of STIR, based on STIR, full stop. And it's a statement, and leave it go.
In other words, give them the information, but don't give them direction. And that's where that was where I was going.
I have no problem adding that into this liaison response. Yes.
Okay, Mark McFadden, and full disclosure, I'm in the UK delegation for Study Group 17. And I will tell you that if all we do is send this as information, that some national delegations are going to use this to say that the ITU must stop in this area and allow 3GPP to move forward. So I think it's actually the two liaison statements are essential, very, very important things to get out of here prior to 17, which meets in 3 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Tony Rakowski send a note to the list about this a couple of days ago, right, saying, you are aware this is going forward, and yeah, so I got that. So we're trying to make sure we get this in before.
Yeah, much appreciated.
I think is when it's due.
So Zheng Hui, so I also recommend that we could include the milestone information about the timing.
When we imagine that we're going to be done with this.
Yeah, something like that.
Right. Okay. I mean, again, I think we're in pretty good shape for a lot of that. So I will not be ashamed for there to be some projected milestones. For the second one, this was one that was referring in particular to whether or not, first of all, whether or not it was appropriate for us to focus on the telephone space, that is the traditional PSTN space, and the internet space, or kind of whether we should choose one or the other. That was one component of the liaison. And I think the argument that we're making in our liaison response is that actually, for the use cases that are of interest to us, a lot of the robocalling and so on is originating in the internet and actually moving to the PSTN from there. And so considering them in isolation, which seemed to be kind of the explanation of being asked for, it didn't seem appropriate to me, and we pushed back on that. There was also an objection that had come up from, I think it's from Dubai, that suggested that anything that we put into SIP signaling that is going to further identify people necessarily exposes the system to new privacy risks. And this is something we take quite seriously here. The alternative that was under consideration in that one was that some kind of a large database would actually use statistical analysis of metadata on calls in order to ascertain which ones were spam and which ones were not. And I think our response here is basically that we believe we have a good story about how to maintain anonymity even with the proposed RFC 4474 BIS system, since you're not obliged to claim an identity when you place a call. You can make your identity anonymous at invalid.net, just as in the PSTN. You can choose to withhold your caller ID. And if I don't like that, I won't answer your call. Right? This is a problem that has, through use, been solved in the past. But we also tacked on a bit of text to that to say, but that thing you're talking about, that big database that you're going to record all this metadata in, we're not sure the privacy properties of that are actually all that awesome. So we'd actually suggest, and there's a pointer there to our recent pervasive monitoring RFC, that they take a look at that and maybe rethink what appropriate approaches to this are. That I think was the substance pretty much of the proposed responses. They've been on the list. Their due date is I believe the end of the month, so it's next week, next Tuesday or something. And so if there's concerns about that, I think Martin, your intervention, as we would say in the ITT, has been a valuable one, and we appreciate the esteemed gentleman from AT&T for giving us that advice. I'd say let's include that.
So given the feedback that we just got in the room, John, there's probably some word tweakage.
I mean, I think there was a request to add a particular
Yeah.
sentence, yeah.
Yeah.
And Martin, if you'd like to propose what that language would be and send it to the list, I would really be grateful. Because if I send it, I'm sure it'll say something you don't want it to say. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So if you've not reviewed this, please do so and get your comments in quickly. I mean, is a deadline of Tuesday of next week way too short, or can we?
Well, we've got to get it out by the end of the week, so I think it's got to be that kind of a deadline.
Yep. All right.
Oh, Tay.
Well, move on to 4474 BIS then.
Sure.
See if I can convince this thing to get in control of my computer back.
Now, 4474 BIS is not going to be the same Star Wars scroller. Actually, it's used for me to read. There's actually like a monitor here for me to read the bullets on. I always have to be kind of. It makes me feel standoff, especially since we're being videoed from there. You know, I'm like, and I have to turn this way to do it. I think mostly you'll be getting the back of my hand. I have 1 foot in the pink cage. That's all I'll commit to. Can you shrink this a little? No, I'm sorry. Oh, it's like a little, yeah, the top things are in.
Yes, it's gone. The heading is gone.
No, but I can do this.
Do what you got.
Run it a different way.
It's all right. I mean, so really what this first slide is doing is reiterating for the benefit of those who not often attend the STIR working group, how we've chosen to, how we've chosen to organize the work here. We made a decision that we were going to produce a deliverable that would cover what we're going to put into the signaling of SIP specifically for the in-band solution, what the header would look like, and what all the associated cryptography would look like to provide an assurance of the identity of the sender of a call. Then we're going to have a separate deliverable on the credentials that are actually used to provide that cryptographic signature. So I'm going to talk about the first of those here, and then Sean Turner will be talking about the certs themselves in a moment. Now, the good news is you can flip.
Ready?
Yeah, next slide. We don't have a ton to talk about this actually, because we've done like a lot of work. There's a couple things left that I want to talk about, but I think we're getting pretty close on this actually. Martin, you don't close? I have a slide that's just for you, Martin, you know. about PAI. So yeah, we deleted a good deal of legacy text, and actually you can thank your esteemed chair, Robert Sparks, for having sent me just pointers to a bunch of places where legacy stuff from RFC 4474 was over-explaining things that simply don't need to be explaining now. In some cases where the guidance has actually become outdated since Cullen and I wrote that in like 1999 or whatever it was. We also tried to eliminate some of the cross-referencing. We had just a lot of things that were in different sections and had like different pointers between them. I even created a couple new subsections so that we could refer to something more narrowly when we had some long section and we're like, oh, the guidance you're looking for is in like 5.1, and that's like 3 pages for you to comb through. So we try to just better organize it, get it into better shape for people to read it, review it, understand it. That much said, I mean, this is probably something I could optimize more. I think I made a reasonable dent in it, but there's probably more that we could do. We did lower the date threshold to 1 minute across the board. Previously, we had talked about this and we weren't sure what we wanted to do. Just in case you forget what this is the date threshold after which you should consider a message to be stale. If you receive it, we require there to be a date header stamp in these requests in order to prevent people archiving these messages and then trying to replay them at a much later time. And originally in 4474, for various reasons, because we had slightly different protection properties from the signature in that, it was quite a bit longer. It was like 10 minutes or something in that. We've actually brought it all down to 1 minute in this. We also fixed the mandatory signature over A equals fingerprint. You may recall that we had a spirited, interesting, and ultimately successful discussion about preserving the cryptographic keys that would appear in SDP under all circumstances. This too conforms with our general mandate now in the IETF in order to defeat pervasive monitoring, to do what we can to make sure that we're securing communications opportunistically as much as we can. So consider this an opportunistic way of making sure that you can guarantee that the RTP session that will be generated by the setup request cannot be trivially man-in-the-middle if you're using SRTP. One wrinkle that came up with this that we talked about last time was, what if you have multiple fingerprints that are actually in the same message because you have for multiple media lines or offering, perhaps you're using different keys for them for some reason. Our solution for that is that you concatenate all of them and that you order the fingerprints, all the non-identical fingerprints in alphanumeric order. That's the best we had. Anybody has a problem with that, let me know. We also improved the canon text, though. There's more that we need to talk about here. I guess Paul Kisviat is not here. I don't know if he's in the remote room. He actually mentioned this in the list last week. What about the to? Adding the to the canon as well as the from. Why don't we flip to the next slide? Yeah. So we talked a lot about canonizing the to. A big part of this effort is this canonicalization process by which we take telephone numbers, which may come in a variety of different forms, unfortunately, and may be transformed. Canonicalizing. We are canonicalizing the telephone yes, we will canonize. We'll beatify them first. We'll beatify them first, then we'll canonize them. Sorry, we will canonicalize them. Since we abbreviated this to canon, okay? I mean, anyway. The canon parameter. So originally, obviously, we wanted the canonicalization process to make sure that if the telephone number that's in the from header field is transformed by intermediaries as it goes through networks, which unfortunately they often are. This is when you're passing international boundaries or even just using visual separator characters differently. We want to be able to reduce this through basically a string prep algorithm to something that would be consistent to both the signer and the authentication service and the verifier who's ultimately going to do the verification of the signature. We'd done that for the from header field, and then we realized we needed to do it for the to as well. We have the to header field under the signature to make sure that we're not using a trivial replay attack where, okay, you know, you're sending a request to John, and great, now that John has this request, and I want to impersonate you to Henning. Well, if there's nothing that says who the to is, and I send this to Henning, well, Henning might think that this is a legitimate request for him. So we want to canonicalize the to header field as well. The problem I ran into, and I started figuring out how to specify this, and the reason why this isn't fixed yet, but it'll be fixed after this meeting, what are these mixed cases where like the from is a green field URI, say, and the to is a TN, or vice versa, and how we want a canon to be structured. So the original plan we agreed on was that we would just have them both be canon T, and semicolon, and then F, semicolon. So yeah, the proposal is that we'll just do the BNF so that you can have either T or F or both be present in canon. And in my little 04, that is what is written up. Martin, I'm sorry, did you have something on this? That seems copacetic? Anybody think that that isn't going to work for some reason that I don't foresee right now?
Other than PAI?
That's the next slide. Get your PI.
Ready?
Okay. So I'm going to do that. Okay. Just for you, my good friend, Mr. Dali, there's a slide here about PII. So sometimes the telephone number that expresses the identity of the caller lives in this header called P asserted identity, which Cullen and I specified in RFC 3325 after like an ether binge in 2001 that we regretted for the rest of our lives. But unfortunately, it's become
The rest of the world likes it.
yeah, irretrievably, it's become just irrevocably entrenched in the operation of this protocol, and there's nothing we can do about it. So this is regrettable, but we need a way to deal with this in this case, I think. Martin at least has persuaded me of that. So here's the easy out. The easy out is to just say this. Okay, you're the kind of guy who likes having PAI in your requests. Just put what you think the canonicalization of the telephone number in PAI is into canon. And if you're sending it to somebody who also likes PIIs, then they will know, just as you know, that they should look in the canon and that what is in there should be what would be in the PAI. That has absolutely no semantic indication in the message whatsoever that you're doing this. There's just a canon present, but what effectively, the way that we reflect this in the text is we would say the canonicalization algorithm is what will change. And we'll say, if you're doing canonicalization, if PAI is present, first step, use that instead of using the from header field. And so we'll literally just define the canonicalization process in such a way that it implements 3325. This is my cleverest easy out for this. However, it is very, well, like PAI itself. It is not very explicit semantically in the request that this is what it's doing. We're just going to assume that people who implement this are going to get it right and know what to do. That's the first issue with it. Well, what do you think, first of all, Martin? Is that easy out? Is that not a simple, elegant, economical solution? No bits added to the wire.
Yeah, but it's your added words that are no, the words that came out of your mouth, not necessarily on the paper.
Dramatizing this is delayed and you know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, PAI is well defined. You're saying it's not well defined. I'm confused.
So this is all about the ambiguities. You know, first of all, I understand that some like idiot area director revised that 3427 document, replaced a thing called 5727 that eliminated the P headers, eliminated a lot of the spec T stuff that Mark Watson back then. Remember Mark Watson created in 3324? That was a while ago. It's not. What that meant for what you're actually supposed to do in terms of like chopping off PAI, I think is now totally unspecified, and we're just like, I mean, because we decimated that when we eliminated the P header process. This is Wild West. So if I sound like I don't know what's going to happen, it's because for this kind of network, I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen. Ellen. Andrew.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I would have some concerns, I guess, because as you mentioned, the spec T, so the PAI is stripped off in many cases at the edge of the trust domain, and now we're relying that whatever entities are stripping off PAI are also going to know what to do with the canon.
Well, first of all, is PII actually stripped by any network?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take a step back through the annals of history and international ISUP. Okay, everything's based on a trust boundary, and if you did not trust the far end to properly the restriction presentation parameter, honor the presentation restriction parameter, then you didn't pass certain information about the calling party because of privacy issues. And so
and Q931, and we could have a whole bunch of comparable examples of that, yes, in the SS7 and so on world. Yes, Colin.
So I
I mean, in the systems where PAI actually works in an interoperable way today, and it may work different ways in different systems, I don't see this making things any worse. This just seems like a fine solution. This doesn't solve any of the problems inherent in PAI, but it doesn't make any of them worse. And if it's working for you,
let me give you the one that does. Maybe this is just implied in the slide, not explicit. If I sign this request in a PAI-like network, it leaves the network boundary. PII is chopped.
Yeah.
As long, Canon is still there, then you can read Canon and you will correctly resolve as a verifier and everything will work for you, right? But shouldn't Canon be stripped? And if it is stripped, then you'll have no idea what the hell that number was because you don't have PAI, and so you will fail validation. Maybe that's right. So.
But at the place where it's supposed to be anonymized, you needed to anonymize it, right? And you can believe those networks do it or don't do it. Doesn't really matter. This does not make the situation
It makes it different. Yeah.
That's my argument. It doesn't make it any worse. I agree. It makes it different.
It might not be any worse. I agree. It'll lead to failures in cases where you're crossing that boundary in that way.
So Keith Drage here. First of all, I mean, there's going to be lots of places where you might strip PAI because you don't trust the entity you're sending it to enact any privacy that may exist on it. But also, you're going to be running this presumably through lots of systems that don't actually understand your canon. And therefore are going to pass the canon through unchanged because they don't understand it, even though they do understand PAI. So what's the backwards compatibility?
So, I mean,
and how are you going to address that?
We do kind of hand wave a bit, but this is a very thoughtful hand wave on whether or not people who receive these things are going to understand canon. And our best thinking about this is that they will. But this is the circumstance again where if you're literally stripping PAI, it is hopeless that you would be able to process. What?
So pretend I'm at the floor. I just don't want to screw up the projector. Robert Sparks. There's a dual case that I want to point out that's implicit in this, in that you have a message that has had a canon parameter in it, and it suddenly floats into a network that decides to add a PAI.
Yes, that's another one.
It's going to break the same way.
Okay, Martin Daly. I mean, as far as I'm aware, that the only time a PAI would be created is when you cross domains, i.e. CS to PS, and you're interworking ISUP into SIP. In that instance, I wouldn't necessarily expect the PSTN gateway to be doing the signing, because you don't know what ISUP network that came from, and even if it originated IP, which is the case John mentioned earlier, where it came from somewhere else in the world, ends up at some rogue enterprise asterisk gateway in some rural part of the United States that then just dumps arbitrarily with whatever calling party number into the SS7 network. So I mean, we would not sign that.
So I mean, let's take that to its logical conclusion, Martin. Is the easy out here actually that if you're crossing a spec tree boundary, you strip identity?
Well, Keith Drage again. That's not the rules at the moment. But what I actually stood up to say is there are examples in IMS where you do create a PAI at a boundary. So the business trunking, for example, you get an enterprise network sending stuff to IMS. If the IMS is quite likely to create a PAI if it doesn't like what it's getting from the enterprise, much in the same way as it would do in the PSTN nowadays with Q931.
I want to get back to it. It's just my other easy out I was offering to Martin here. Again, maybe the answer is that if you're crossing a spec T boundary, a place where PAI either is added or stripped, you strip all of identity. You strip the identity header, identity info, identity reliance, and anything like that. I mean, again, because in those networks, you're right. There is no base attestation. I mean, to your point, the entity who would be signing this anyway what is their relationship to the number ranges that they're making these assignations for?
So relaying a comment from Paul Kisvat on the Jabber channel, he said, relaying a comment from Paul Kisvat on the Jabber channel, he says, this discussion needs to separate between the cases where the PAI value is equal to the from value and those where it doesn't.
Where it canonicalizes is equal to the from and where it doesn't, yes.
It seems so, yeah.
Also a good point, Paul.
Okay, so to answer your question, John, I mean, you know, I believe the identity information should not be stripped, but nor should it be signed as though it was trusted.
Well,
no, but let me finish. I believe that, you know, a total solution in this space is, because carriers can't arbitrarily drop calls, but what we can do is give some type of presentation to the end user that, you know, a call originated on Comcast. Comcast signed it. AT&T would present to our users, this phone number that I'm presenting to you has been verified by Comcast. We provide some green light. We provide something user-friendly, you know, in this new medium to the user, saying that, you know, they should be able to trust this. And for the other identifiers, we also then present, this number has not been verified. And you let the end user make the choice. Do I care to answer this call or not? It's the user, no, it's the user's choice. It's not the carrier's choice on whether they choose to pick up or answer the call or session.
Got all that. Again, I think the solutions I'm describing can have those properties, the ones you just described. Again, right? I mean, what is a PAI that you strip at the end of the day and leave no identity information in the header, other than an attestation that you don't know whether this is valid or not, right? I mean, that is in fact the semantics that would result from what I'm describing doing. So, I mean, this it may be I need to write this down and get this to the list or something before we'll get the properties of this understood. And again, I'm kind of seat of the pantsing this one, but it might actually be that this isn't the wrong thing to do. So, Keith, did you have another?
Yeah, so Keith Drage, I mean, I'm very nervous about people saying, oh, just because we're introducing this new capability, we're now going to start stripping stuff at a trust domain boundary. That's basically changing the definition of the trust domain that existed before you actually came along.
I
think what I would like to be able to do, what I would like to be able to do is properly analyze the compatibility issues that would be associated with introducing this before we actually agree to anything on that. Maybe you need some more words in your document about the compatibility issues.
I was just saying, yeah, maybe what we need is to write some text and kind of go through and describe what we think these things are. I honestly don't think it's that different, though, from what we're describing the desired cases are.
Yeah, Andrew, so that was my point. Let's not make assumptions that things that are stripping off the PAI are overnight going to understand what the canon is and strip that as well.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, there are plenty of things that are compliant with PAI that would have no idea what the identity header is and could leak what is in canon accidentally as a result of that. And yes, that is a material concern about this. So yeah, that's why I have good idea, hidden problems. Also, just comment, is this a slippery slope? Martin, I'm willing to go with you on this for PAI, but the day that it's now the 3GPP charge info number, or the data that it's the 16 other places that telephone numbers representing the caller are the things that need to be signed, I will draw a line in the sand.
Okay, so basically right now within the 3GPP specs, if there is a PAI present, the PAI is what's presented to the end user. There may be instances where there is no PAI present, and in those instances, and this is optional, not mandatory, the from may be displayed to the UE. And so you're not going to get the slippery slope that you're trying to paint there doesn't exist.
Well, it's a question, man. I don't know. There's a lot of other numbers in 3GPX. I'm just saying, if people are going to start coming for that, there's not going to be 15 things we're signing.
You're making a statement on something.
You think there's no P charge number? Okay. Thanks. All right. Shaki-san here, did you split?
He had an earlier flight, he had to leave.
Okay. So since we talked about CNIT in dispatch, I at least want to have one slide here about the extensibility properties of this mechanism. The extensibility properties of this mechanism today are effectively non-existent, and that's by design. Having security mechanisms that have a lot of knobs and whistles that would lead to variable strength assertions is bad, and we typically don't want to do that. Now, there is this one special case where we're talking about information that is often literally adjacent in the signaling to the numbers that we're going to be canonicalizing. That is the display name or some other comparable indication that appears in the request of what the name is of the entity that is placing this call. If there's a need for that to be captured and for it to be covered by STIR's signature specifically, and this is something that Richard in the dispatch meeting expressed as desirable, we're going to need to figure out a way to leave that door open. I think the best way for us to leave that door open is to leave that door and only that door open, not to create some general extensibility mechanism that might do this for this and 15 other things. But if there's like one thing that we can have kind of similar style the way that we do identity reliance in the draft today, that is a blank for CNIT specifically to fill. I won't barf at that, but if so, we got to do it now because this document is pretty close to where it needs to be.
So Martin Thompson, have you considered simply canon 2? You know, canon with two ends?
Canon is not actually covered by the signature.
Oh, okay, well.
That's an intentional property of canon.
Right, but whatever you have, a second, make a new one.
Well, yeah, so what we
if
do
that comes
here,
up.
we have this big field we concatenate, right? If you think about it, it's got like the canonicalizations of the to and the from, it's got the date header, it's got the method.
You're missing, you're not getting this point yet.
Yeah, so you have a signature that describes, you have a field that contains a signature that covers a certain set of, a fixed set of fields, right? You've got no knobs to control whatever goes into the input of that signature, right?
With the caveat about identity reliance, yes.
Right, and if you want to put something different under that signature, make something different.
And give it a different name. Instead of having
name.
canon in your identity header, have canon 2 is where he's trying to go.
Go ahead. Yeah,
I think that's the suggestion on the thing here is that we add, in the same way we did in the reliance, we add another completely different name that has a different signature in it, right? I mean, that's what you're suggesting, I believe.
Okay.
I believe we're all saying the same. Just canon's the wrong word. Yeah.
Canon is something that's like not in the signature.
We will add another signature in another field that has the data. Right. That is arbitrarily extensible, I think you'll find. So that is not.
What I want to avoid though, Martin, is having to perform 2 cryptographic operations each time we're going to send a request. I want this to be ideally one SIG.
That may be unavoidable, given the problem you're describing as it is. If you want to be backwardly compatible with someone who might only understand the old thing.
Well, but again, yeah, I think it's that there will be an empty field, right? And you'll be signing that empty field, which, you know, if we've got a separator character, you'll see separator with nothing in it or separator with something in it. And if you,
That works too. Yeah. Brian Rosen, I think this is fine. I think restricting it is a good idea. Create the blank thing. I think all of that is just great.
and you seem really upset about this.
No, I'm just trying, and I was just handing short something. I didn't have the benefit of hearing all the dispatch discussion. So what I'm a little bit worried about is because CNIT is still very much in the pre-conceptual phase.
Agreed.
And just in terms of the possible set of options that may turn out to be reasonable, it can be as usual in the broadly speaking by value or by reference. It can be by internal reference and by external reference. Internal, I mean body part. It could be, and by value, it could be, and the reference could be in the calling for header, it could be the new header. The value could be in an existing header, such as the display name, and that. So all seem at least plausible. We can argue which one is better, that's not the point here, but they're at least plausible, and indeed I can, in one of the things based on the list discussion, that is at least a not unreasonable way to deal with that is that we really have to deal with two very different end systems, namely legacy end systems that have very limited display capabilities. And so they need to get a display name that's validated, but that's really all they can do. Whether they can do 16 characters or a few more is a different issue, but they're not going to be rendering XML.
Yes.
And then there's a second one, ones where I can provide a lot more information, metadata type information beyond the name, location and business type and certifications and Better Business Bureau ratings, you name it, whatever one could imagine. I don't know, consumer report ratings, just to pick up on something completely unrelated to this. So my concern is that it's going to be really hard, given the pretty diverse nature of that, not to end up essentially wishing we had a more general mechanism, because whatever mechanism that assumes it's a header or a header part may not quite do it.
Well, I mean, maybe then it's worth it for that to have a second cryptographic operation if it's going to be a SIG here that will define a separate header when CNIT comes around.
Yeah, the other piece is, and that's probably more so, is that it is not implausible that signing will take place in two places, namely one that signs the number, say the carrier is a natural place to do that, and one that signs a third party. Yeah. And I know
this was very much what we did in dispatch. We went through kind of the different.
But a third party that does the CNET signing, so they shouldn't be tied to each other necessarily because they have their own business models and things that they can do. And so in that sense, that would also argue that there is some advantage to having a provision for a second signature in there that can be validated independently, but as well as inserted independently.
And as you say, I mean, having a complete by reference system where it's actually the recipient that looks these things up for the third party is an architecture that's worked in the past in the PSCN. Having an address book that's here that's going to display you know, exactly what the display name is for calling this work. So we all know there's going to be a proliferation of options. The argument that Chalky was basically making is we think there is a, you know, origin of SIP request option that we want to have in this, and he wants this field specifically for the cases where that is going to be how it works.
Okay.
So, I mean,
I don't know if you want to take the end or.
Okay.
So Robert.
Dan York, we see you there, Pac-Man. What's up?
So I just had a question. Back at the beginning of STIR, we had this whole discussion about whether STIR was going to just be the telephone number or whether we were going to get into caller ID, the display name. And at that time, we decided that it was only going to be the telephone number. So I guess my question is, are we now revisiting that decision and saying that we do need to get into doing the display names?
No, so it's that the CNIT work, so presuming CNIT is chartered in something like a form we were describing in dispatch, it's gonna pick what this field looks like. It's gonna talk about a variety of acquisition methods by which you can get this data. One of them happens to be something that is tightly enough coupled to STIR that it is at least a hypothesis that we could create a hook, right, at this point of the design of the protocol that would support that modality for assuring CNIT. And we wouldn't be doing the thinking about this, right? I mean, what I have up on the slate is we create a blank, right? We basically give CNIT a blank check. Say, hey, man, whatever it is you think is going to fill this, you'll be able to use this field for it.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I was just trying to figure out how this fit into what we had talked about back when this all began. Thanks.
Roger that.
Hi, this is Sean Turner. I think you kind of hinted at this when you were responding to Henning, but if you have multiple signatures, you have multiple verifies as well, right?
Yeah,
so then we have to make sure like the same person is signing. When you go off and verify, we don't have these like crazy trees. So when we do this, we have to just make sure that we document it smartly, I guess.
I'd rather have one signature if that can be managed.
That's exactly why you want one.
Henning, I'm all for simplicity. I'm just trying to recognize that given that we know already based on the preliminary dispatch discussion that they are likely going to be at least two entities that insert the information, that's kind of quite plausible operational model. I don't want to find ourselves in the situation that I'm less worried about the validation. I would rather have it be validated once, but that seems hard to do if you have to insert in two different locations where the two entities don't necessarily trust each other. I mean, completely, in the sense that they don't hand each other keys to re-sign. The other model is the carrier, if downstream, because you would start with a phone number typically. I mean, that would be the first piece that you typically would start with. So the carrier signs the phone number, hands it off to the third-party validator, Dun & Bradstreet, or you name it, and it would have access to the signing key for that number, and we wrap the thing. If it outsources the SIP request to that, sends a proxy SIP request to Dun & Bradstreet, comes back signed. But that requires a lot of trust in sharing keying material, which probably isn't a hot idea, because I don't think AT&T would want to share all of its keying material, even with a business partner.
No, Martin's actually nodding. He seems cool with that in the back. I'm joking. He was like about to barf.
So I guess I'll get into this a little bit later, but at least the validation and the verification schemes we've been looking at actually do allow you to send up 2 requests in one blob. So that'd be good. But remember too, if we're signing and having multiple signers, the exchanges are going to get bigger because you have 2 certs, and there are implications. But
yeah, hard it is on that. All right, so I don't know where that leads us exactly on this. I mean, it could be what we really need is we're going to be doing another rev, I think, because we want to do the things with Canon and the things to fix Martin's PII problem. It could be that we want to wait a little more on CNET. We have a mandate to try to arrive at a CRISPR charter for them in the short term, or I can propose something, right, that just creates this blank for them to fill in. And again, let's be somewhere in the separator field of our concatenated identity string. There's going to be a potentially empty separator. Is anything in there? It's up to CNET to figure out how to make it semantically clear what it means. And if somebody doesn't understand it, and to do so in such a way that it will not lead to verifiers failing if they're not CNET aware.
So this is Sean Turner. I think we should drive the spec. So any suggested text and putting it in and then hacking around, I think, is the way to go, as opposed to just doing nothing and waiting. Because, yeah, I think it's a better approach.
Suggestion would be to put it in, and if we actually get this to the point where we are ready to publish it as an RFC, and we don't think CNET's in a good enough shape that we trust that leaving the blank there is a good idea, it'd be very easy to pull it back out.
Yank it, yeah.
I support that, Brian Rosen. I support that. I'd like to have it left in, and I think that the notion of, if we're not far enough along that we can't say that it's going to be useful in the format it is, then we can drop it.
So if
that's
a couple minutes?
Fine answer.
If we still have a couple minutes, let's go a little further down the rabbit hole. So let's say that the default behavior that we would expect for this, if we're going to have this in there, would be that we take display name. And what we could do is we could create a canonicalization that basically says, if display name is what's present, what you're using, we'll put something in Canon, right? And this is where Canon can help us, that says like DN. We'll have like an option. Again, because Canon is added to the end of identity info. We'll just put something next to that that has like, okay, DN is what the CNIT is. CNIT equals DN, right? And that at least will be a trigger to any compliant implementation to know whether or not it's going to be able to parse that. Right? Martin looks already unhappy about this. The problem being that if it comes from somewhere else, like say PAI, we would need to have similar parameters. So what I don't want to, let me up level and explain why I'm having so much consternation about this. The verifier needs to be able to produce a bit exact version of the string that the authentication service is providing, right? So it needs to know whatever that information is, how to derive it from the remainder of the signaling that it has its hands on. And like, so there is a compatibility issue. There's no capability negotiation that is going to be completely satisfactory for that is extensible. That at least that immediately comes to mind. So if anybody thinks I'm crazy and there is actually an easy way to solve that, I'd like to hear what people think it is.
I'll step out because I'm not answering that point, so.
I think that I understand what your problem is. I think that what is.
You have no idea what my problems are, man. You may get this one. This is just the surface
All right.
of an ocean of problems.
Let me start again. I believe that it will not be difficult for CNET, once it gets organized, to come up with a precise algorithm which would be used to create the string that would go in the field that you would leave. And I would prefer at this point that you don't have any words in the document that do things like say the display name goes here and blah, blah, blah. Don't do that yet. Just do what you said you would do, which is we're going to leave a place in this algorithm for a string to be defined for the name, TBD, what the piece of the algorithm that creates that string is.
I'd like to have at least one thing I think will work that we could do that before I'm entirely willing to endorse that.
Why do you need that?
It may be that there's nothing we can do that will work.
Then we'll drop the mechanism.
Okay. Okay.
So you would.
Colin's next.
Colin, Jason, I'm glad to go with that sort of suggestion. There's just this blank string, which maybe we figure out how to fill something in there, maybe we never do. But I mean, you just got to point out that the obviousness of there's no there's no compatible way to migrate a system that supports these to continuing to support them, right? It's a total break flag day system, so it's almost impossible to deploy. And I also point out, if any other standards organization decides to define something to put in that field, it will also be a unprecedented disaster, right? Or not unprecedented, a disaster.
Not unprecedented. Henning, do you
yeah, so my one kind of, and I'm not sure, maybe I'm just not understanding what Brian and others want, is that at the time a document is published, if somebody implements it, it can't be that suddenly when CNET decides to do something, which is probably going to be a little while after the publication, that implementation, at least in some cases, namely when that mechanism is exercised, fails in that, because that would, yeah, I mean, that seems like if we want to get rapid deployment, that's exactly the wrong model, because then if lots of things fail initially for wrong reasons, people will start discarding it and we'll just lost all the initial deployment effort. So that's my only concern, is that we have to, at the time of publication, that mechanism has to be sufficiently well specified. They don't have to wait, implementers don't have to wait for CNET to write a compliant implementation.
And we're on video today because people care about getting this robocalling problem fixed. And again, we could hold this entire spec until CNET is done, right? I mean, it's.
But again, just to finish that thought, is I do think that the notion that there will be a canonical display name, not just as one mechanism, not the only one I've seen it, if we can fairly, because it's not like some anonymous group of people that have no connection to anybody in this room that's going to be in CNET, that if there is insufficient agreement that as one low cost and relatively operationally well familiar, because it's carriers that are signing that, that actually may well be the mechanism which doesn't have a bad property that I mentioned, namely third party, because the display name is the most likely one to be inserted by the carrier, just like it's today, by CNAM database population. And so if that's what we can basically do as an interoperable way, and then do something else later, and deal with it more complicated, because it may actually turn out that the CNET model ends up being self-signed. It may actually simply associate a number to a display string and binds those cryptographically. So there is really, as long as you get that, and you can get it by FedEx, you don't need any STIR signing there, because it simply says, if you get that phone number, this is the business name that it belongs to, and we don't care how you got that phone number. That's your problem.
I mean, right. And to be clear, even the identity info header, when you dereference it, could give you the display name. because it's from the same origin attestation, right? And like, it'll be given by the carrier or whoever, it'll be that cert, or even as an adjunct to it. The problem is, again, that there's a very specific solution that is motivating this, that it has to be in-band, in-SIP signaling, and it has to be carried that way. And I think we're coming up against what the edges this look like.
Yeah.
Probably, my read of this discussion is either we're going to end up having two signatures, probably, or we're going to have something that's more like a by reference. The cert itself gives you the name. It doesn't literally have to be in the SIP header to deliver this, is the point. And we shouldn't ignore that solution space. That may turn out to be actually the optimal solution space for this list. But sorry, Sean.
We are not time constrained yet,
Yeah, I know.
but we will be soon. So please keep your comments concise.
Fair enough. So this is Sean again. I'm trying to grok why you think it's impossible to upgrade once you pick one. Because I'm thinking, like, if you had a mechanism. Well, right. So you could identify a scheme and then sign over the scheme, and then the verifiers have to understand the schemes. I mean, there's ways you could do that, but it definitely gets more complicated. And so I think the idea is then, complexity is the enemy of good.
The problem you need to remember is that the canonicalization string itself will contain the value, and something else needs to then tell you which of the 6 options for values that is. And that's the problem.
Yeah, okay.
That's the thing I'm running up against. It just doesn't work.
Sanjay Mishra. I just wanted to say I agree with what Brian had proposed. So it sounds like a reasonable way to do it.
Which was
basically what you have under the best idea.
Okay. And if
leave a place for it. Just before we go to publish this thing, we'll decide whether it's going to be useful or not. If it's not going to be useful, we'll drop it.
Okay.
Okay, so Martin Daly, I don't believe there's going to be too many options. I believe that you're either going to have a situation where the originator includes the name, whether it be physically or by reference, or you're going to have a model, and the by reference is kind of a subset of this, where the termination. So either the name is provided in the signaling physically, passed all the way through to the destination, or there's some type of query either by the by reference sent from the originator, or there's some bilateral agreement where the termination knows where to query a trusted database in order to provide trusted information to the user.
Chris Went. I think it's good to err on the side of being aggressive here. I like the idea of using display name. I think for all the reasons that have already been mentioned, just directly putting a name, putting a blob, JSON blob, whatever the mechanism is, a reference, URL, whatever, it can be very flexible. You can always revisit it, but being aggressive so that there is a solution near term that, especially in service provider networks, we can sort of adopt and deploy as soon as possible.
Let me ask a question. The two mechanisms we know already that follow kind of Martin's type of approach inserted by the originator. I'm much less worried about the later one because they'll solve their own problems either by implicit trust or by some other mechanism. But we do know we have at least two plausible things, namely the string, literal string, and the display name, and a call info to a URL, which needs to be protected. That URL needs to be protected, but they're a very different thing, and they can both be present at the same time.
Yep.
So we need to be very clear in that case, because we know these are, given the limited stuff that we have, these are kind of the make no changes to SIP options, which is always attractive for a variety of reasons. So if we have those two options, we should think about, can we do that in that model without creating complexity?
That's what I said. You'd add something like Canon, right, that has scheme is either DN, right? CNIT equals DN or CNIT equals CI, right?
Okay, as long as that works, I think
we could do that, but in this case, I prefer to let CNIT figure that out, right? I mean, that's the point.
We need to know that before we ship.
So, but what we do for now is have the blank, and we give them we empower them to be able to add an identity info parameter and say that this bud's for you. This blank that we have inserted into our concatenation is reserved for you, and if use it or lose it before this thing goes to the RC editor.
Would we have the same canonicalization parameters for both for display name and the CI?
So no, what we would have obviously a different operation would be performed to extract DN than for CI, right? I mean, and yeah, you would.
So you could do one or the other. That's what you're saying.
Yes, and we
but
would,
not
so
both.
we just. But I want CNET to do that though, right? I want CNET to have a document that says what's
Right.
going to go into that.
No,
blank.
before we ship, because I mean,
Right.
before we ship, they need to have that.
We keep circling back to that. I think we covered it. Let's move, go ahead and move on.
I think we're done right now.
We had one tiny little slide, so.
I mean, let's not last call this. There's more I want to do with PAI to get it right and stuff.
Yeah, but one thing that just looking at it, I should send an email, but since I'm here, is examples would be really, really helpful.
So we decided we're going to do this in a separate document this time.
Okay.
Kind of like Alan's old SIP examples document after 3261.
But it would be helpful to have that for
Sooner than
review,
later.
because I
it.
think that would help reviewing
Yeah.
things.
Well, we had this discussion last time and we decided we were going to punt that to an external rep.
Yeah, I think Cullen and I are kind of on the hook to crank that out, and we just haven't gotten there yet.
I think that's it.
All right, Sean?
People generally feeling comfortable with the kind of stuff we talked about here? Does it seem like we're pretty close? I think we're down to it. All right. If only these CNET jokers could figure out what they need, then we'd be all like, it's all these guys, man. That's me.
We'll see if my computer crashes before I can get your presentation up. Can I see where my mouse is? Hello, mouse. There we go.
Well, we're getting that ready. My name is Sean Turner. I'm working on a search draft. I can get going quickly when I speak. So if I'm going too quickly, you can give me the whole slow to hell down map, and I can repeat things as well. So this is the stir certs draft. Now, the funny part is it actually includes more than just stuff about certs. It's got revocation and other things in there. And this draft is kind of like which draft is like not like the others, right? So this is the whole PKI stuff. So I tried to liven the slides a little bit up so that people will stay engaged, because usually we present and everyone goes, oh, it's PKI and glosses over. So basically, yeah, exactly, right? So basically, I just want to like bring everybody back like to the basics here, right? There's two sides of this stuff. When we're actually going to like sign things, you got to sign, you got to verify. I said that earlier. I just want to kind of drive this home, right? When you're going to sign the call, well, before you're going to sign the call, right, you got to generate some keys, you got to get enrolled, and you got to get your keys and certs, right? Now you sent this great thing with one or more signatures, obviously, to the verifier, and then he's got to do a bunch of stuff, right? Well, he's got to build the cert path, you got to go find the thing, right? Then you got to do some maths, right? Because you got to make sure all the elliptic curve stuff that we're gonna pick works. You got to check the path from the root down, and then you got to check the status and the authorizations. And because we're not linking the fact that you've got a name and the authorizations, you actually have to do this twice. And the focus of this talk today basically is on the last two steps. And for those who didn't know, that's Harvey Two-Face Dent from Batman in Lego form. So really, this is kind of the status check options, really kind of laying it out. And I guess I would categorize this as you kind of pay for it now or pay for it later. Because basically you could set up a mechanism which you did actually no verification checking at all. You just use really short-lived certs for like every call. But then you've got to do all that enrollment and all that key generation and all that stuff at the beginning, and that can be kind of painful. So as you like, bring the lifetime of your cert back, your paying goes at the beginning, and if you stretch it out, it kind of ends up being on the verifier side, because then they have to go get all this, they have to like build these paths. If you don't give them the information, they have to go find it. So one of the reasons why that's why we send the cert with the message, so you basically have a place to start. So, right? So you got to find the info. Well, luckily the what sign the thing is actually in the message, and then there's a bunch of stuff in the certs that we can actually use. And I guess the real split between the short-lived certs and querying an authority for actually the status information and the authorization checks really comes down to whether you agree with my assertion that if you do short-lived certs, it's really painful because you have to do all this stuff, or whether it's querying the authority. And my assertion is actually right now, is that short-lived certs are probably just going to be too painful. It comes down to call setup time, and you'd have to go do this thing however long you would want to think it is. I think if we were going to pick that thing, we'd have to do a study to figure out how long people have, like how long they keep their phone numbers on one thing to try to come up with a good time for how long you would let them go. And again, as the window goes longer, you open up your threat window for when you could be hacked, right? Or if there's a compromise. So I think we're kind of happy with certs. We haven't quite actually figured out what the time frames would be, how long those certs will be good for. And I'm hoping maybe we can find some data somewhere to maybe give some guidance, but obviously I think it's going to be up to the operators to determine how much pain they want to inflict on their customers. And then the query options, basically there's 3 of them, and that's what I'm going to spend the next couple slides over. One is CRLs, the other one is SCVP, and the other one's OCSP. Richard?
Stapling question mark?
Sorry?
Stapling?
Yeah, so that's in there. I'm going to get to that as well. Okay, so next. So the first thing is CRLs, and most people think when you say CRLs, they basically think the thing on the right, right? And it's like CRLs, this is the old stodgy mechanism, just don't do this thing, it's crazy, stay away. Most people have in their minds the DoD PKI where the things are like multi-megabytes and growing, some are hundreds of megabytes. So you don't really want to do that on a phone, right? So you've signed this thing, it comes to you, and you're like, you're going to go get this thing, and the room goes dark, right? Or your phone runs out of battery. So you don't want to do that. Now the interesting thing about CRLs is though, if you're running a CA, you're going to make these things anyways, right? Because you have to have audit procedures, you have to keep track of all the ones you did, and it's easier just to kind of keep them all in one big blob. So your CA is going to make it. It's whether or not you're actually going to make it available to the people to check. You also use CRLs sometimes as a way to prime OCSP responders. So you would make this thing and then dump it in the OCSP server, and then it kind of parses out if you get a request. We'll get in that in a minute. So basically, they've got a bad rap because they're humongous, and it's not cool because they're not online. Now the truth of the matter is that you can actually do partitioning mechanisms where you can split them up based on every 1,000 certs you put a new CRL. You can have revocation or CRL set up for different revocation reasons. You can do partials and deltas and the whole 9 yards. But with those, what ends up happening is I've got to sign a message. I find a CRL. It's partitioned. Do I have all the partitions? Now I got to go find all the partitions. So it kind of like ends up being a not so great kind of model for how to do it. Theoretically, it's great, but I think in practice, it's kind of a little fetchy. So basically, I'm basically not recommending that we use these things for.
That's not right.
What's not right?
In the partitioned, the certificate tells you which partition it's in.
Right, but if there's other ways, sorry, yes, I misspoke. If you divvy it up other ways, you may have to go check all of them. So, all right. So I'm basically saying, I think that if you're running a CA, you're probably going to make a CRL anyways. I think you're going to do that for audit purposes. But I basically don't think we should be relying on CRLs. Oh, I guess I should back up. So the 02 version of the 01 version of the draft was published yesterday, and I apologize. All of the changes were basically in section 4.2, and all of these slides are about all of those changes. So I'm saving you from reading the specifics of the word, the specifics of the text, but that's basically what it's all about. Brian.
Brian Rosen. So we haven't gotten to this point, but the problem I think with even thinking about CRLs is you've got to do the piece that says, is this cert good for this number? And once you're doing that,
I'm getting to that part.
Okay.
Right. So, and I guess that's the other thing is these CRLs. This is only checking about the status of the certificate. This is not checking of the authorization. That's back to the first part. So we're still on the first thing we're looking at. The second bullet is the authorization part, and we'll get to that at the end. So yeah, if you're gonna just check the status and the authorizations, you'd have to like extend the CRL. So I don't know if that's a great idea. So next. So SCVP. So I'd like to thank Adam Roach for taking a picture on me. So I kind of did these both at once because basically, online is the way to go, right? If you've got a protocol and you've actually got a connection, you should just be pinging it as quickly as possible as opposed to downloading these things. And this is our outgoing AD, so I thought I'd add that in there. So the difference between OC and OCSP and SCVP, so this is the idea is that you can send a single request in about a certificate and you will get a response back about the cert at that one given time. they kind of can tweak it in a way to make it a little easier by pre-generating responses and all that kind of thing. So they can decide like every day we're going to do this, and if there's an update, they can pre-place it, which is kind of cool. If you compare the two, OCSP is much more widely deployed than SCVP. And there's actually a profile for what they call high volume environments. So the idea is like you're a web browser for Google, right? And you need to have an OCSP server, and it's got to be quick, right? There's like no pun, I guess, intended if you were at SAG, but it needs to be quick. So they profiled a bunch of the options because the PKI guys, I'm one of them, love options. And there's a ton of options, and it's really confusing. And they said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, do this, don't do that. So we could rely on it. Now there's some bugs, but I'll get to that in a minute. And SCVP, the kind of cool thing, which is kind of came on maybe a little later, and again, the PKI guys couldn't decide, was you can actually offload all of the decision-making process to a third entity, to another entity. So you can say, here's this thing, please tell me if you think this is good, and then get back a yes, no, trust, like I trust this thing, yes or no, or they can actually give you back the information and you can decide to trust yourself and kind of make it a little bit like OCSP. But basically, I'm kind of recommending use OCSP because there's stuff out there, we can modify it, it's kind of more well understood. I think that kind of just makes sense if we're going to kind of go for practicality. Now, the difference is the HVE OCSP recommends that SHA-1 be used. I think that's a bad idea. So we should just update it in our spec and just say that's great. And I'm actually checking with some PKI providers to see if they ignored the spec and just updated it. So I'm hoping that maybe some other people that are involved with some CAs can let me know, and if any new CAs come online, that they just do that. Hint, hint, hint.
Some new CA.
Rick Andrews, Symantec. SHA-1 is mentioned in a lot of places.
Yeah.
The consensus seemed to be like to hash the name of the CA. It's perfectly fine for that. So
yes, I believe that's
no
true.
one deviates there.
Yeah.
Right. But for the cert that signs the OCSP response, we use SHA-256 in those certs. Is that what you meant?
Yeah. All right.
Richard Barnes, yeah, Rick, your input here would be valuable as well. But between these two, it seems like OCSP is by far the more widely used one in modern PKIs.
I mean, yeah, I want anybody to tell me they've got one of these that's actually widely deployed and gets hit on a kind of scale that I think one of these will get hit by a phone provider.
Yeah, +1.
I mean, again, right? So in the 00 draft, I just kind of assumed it was OCSP. We never really laid out the thinking for why we would do this. So this is kind of just validating and getting all the text in there and actually kind of moving on. So, all right, great. Next. So this is the second line in the bullet, and this is the authorization check options. So we really got two kind of models and way to think about this. And John gave me these questions, right? We talked about this with a bunch of people before. So. So the questions you have to ask is when you get this cert, right? You can check that the math works and check that the cert works. But when you're actually checking to see whether or not the person who placed the call is actually authorized to place that call, right? Okay. So there's two ways to think about this. For the certificate, is the following number currently in scope of validity? And the second one is what numbers are associated with the certificate? And there's a whole bunch of questions that come around when you start asking these, and that's basically the next two slides.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the interesting part, kind of the work we're doing here. This is the part where we're trying to do something that goes beyond what people are typically doing with PKI in a good way, I think. Yeah. Because we want these certificates to have scope that reflects the telephone numbers for which they are valid. And this fundamental question here of whether you're going to approach this by what are the numbers associated with the certificate, give me everything that the certificate is good for, or whether you're going to approach this as, I received a call for this number signed by this cert. Right. Is this cert valid for that number? You know, do we want verifiers to do that, or do we want them to look at all the numbers associated with the certificate? And we'll go through this a bit here, obviously, but there are, in different cases, potentially uses for both of those.
Right. And so,
but the one will be the much more common case.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that the certificate extension that we're sticking in the cert is like one number, a block of numbers, a tree of numbers with some things cut out. So this is why we need this. If it was a one-to-one correlation, we probably could get away with all that. But we're pretty sure that you're not going to get one-to-one in all cases. So
Yeah, and for those of you that are in modern today, when we were showing those delegation slides that showed how you started with 10,000 blocks, coming from the root authority, going down to CSPs who distributed 100 blocks to enterprises, we imagine certs will reflect ranges like that. And given that we have these questions like, well, okay, is this one of the 1,000 or 10,000 numbers that is valid for the certificate in question that signed this particular call?
I mean, I guess the only thing, Eric, before I let you get going, is the thing I don't love about the extension, I know it's been around for a while, is the sequence of thing, because for encoders, you have to know a little bit more than you need to. So I'll think about that, but there might be the only way to do it, because I know some people spend a lot of time thinking about it. So. Yes, we don't want to do the ordering thing, absolutely.
So Eric Berger, as I've been thinking of this, I actually, believe it or not, do wonder if this is really important. Do we really care, as long as we know who signed the certificate? I.e., if AT&T signed the certificate, but it's not their number, do we really care, because we'll go slap AT&T silly? Or if it's been ported, do we really care? Because, we can find out that, yeah, all right, that's a little old, but it's going to flush out, and particularly if it's ported, we can figure out, where it's gone. So do we actually, I mean, it's intellectually really, really nice to know absolutely positively that, yes, this is really good, and it's really good right now, but do we need to do all of this stuff when it doesn't necessarily really add any value?
So I guess
I'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to that. Okay.
Jeez, I feel like we had a BOF this morning. It was called Modern. And in the Modern BOF, we talked about the possibility. And well, it's not even a possibility, it's a reality today. That there are entities that deal with numbers that are not carrier safe, like AT&T. There are Skypes that have a bunch of numbers assigned to them. They know things about users. They would be able to provide signatures for cases like this, and all the delegative models that we've examined at STIR, regardless of whether or not we start really mucking with any numbering policy. But at the end of the day, I think the IETF probably isn't going to tell you that if you trust AT&T, like, that doesn't matter, you have to look at the number, and that's the only thing you never do. I can easily imagine that there will be consortia where what matters to a verifier is that AT&T signed something, right? But it's not our place, I think, to dictate that that's going to be the what the verification service is going to do. I think it is our obligation to make sure that the cert works in these cases where what people are interested in is the numbers that the cert is assigned for. And I also think in many cases it's our obligation to be sensitive to the carrier that signed it. Though I've heard in the past, actually, a few people express concerns about having the carrier that is associated with a cert be in the cert, because it might let somebody start spidering the space and ascertaining which carriers have which numbers, and there have been business concerns expressed about that. So I think that, again, like in Modern, we're trying to provide a set of tools that there will be a subject of the cert, right? And that subject may be AT&T and be really obvious, or it may be really opaque if AT&T would prefer it to be opaque. And this numbering stuff also, it has a lot of different privacy properties that maybe you don't want to know what all the numbers are associated with the cert. AT&T doesn't want to give you this cert that tells you all these numbers are mine. They only want to answer question number one. Our job, again, is to provide, I think, a set of mechanisms that let you be compatible with the ways people might want to use this. Is that a sufficient answer?
Well, it's academically satisfying, and I would offer the thing we were talking about today. What you're actually saying is it almost doesn't matter what the number is in the cert. It matters who's signing it. It's the only thing that's really important.
There is a use case where that is true, and in a SIP forum-ish use case that you probably are thinking of.
Skype. I'm thinking, I'm thinking Skype or
you think
Google
AT&T
Talk.
cares what Skype attests?
No, we're looking at what the human. It's really who's getting the phone call that's important here.
Yeah, I think a lot of verification services are going to be implemented by CSPs, and the cases where it's going to rely on I trust the entity that signed it are mostly going to be about.
Right. So if it's going to be the CSPs that are going to be turning, as Martin said, the green light on or the red light on, they're also not going to care. At this moment, is this number belong to this CSP?
Yeah, I agree, those guys aren't, but that is one use case and one potential deployment. Our job is to solve for a slightly broader mandate than that. That's all I'm saying.
And I'm offering that there is no other case, though. Things that you have presented as counterexamples are not counterexamples.
Actually, they clearly are. And saying that so you think that if Skype signs something and I choose to trust that, being John Peterson, right, or a peer organization of Skype being Google Voice, because Skype's attestation of the number comes down from the numbering authority that says, I gave Skype this number, you think that that is not a valid attestation? I might not trust Skype in general if they say this is my number, but I trust a cert that they got from AT&T, that they got from the NAMPA that says this is, in fact, a number that has been assigned to this person. That is one of the base use cases of this that is in the problem statement, that is now like an RFC and, you know, in all the threat models and stuff. So, I mean,
I think we're going to have to take this to the list, because I don't see, what does that have to do with, and this certificate right now is for this number? You're talking about all the stuff above it, which is stuff I'm talking about.
what this has to do with is whether Cisco's voicemail system will be hacked as a result of getting a call from a particular number from a service provider that might not be a big name like AT&T. In fact, it probably won't be, right? It'll be from some like minor carrier, right? And if they have an assertion that is valid up the chain for that number, then, well, they have protection against that. Our use cases, and the threat model here is robocalling, right? Voicemail hacking, swatting. These are cases where the number matters, and it matters to entities that are not carriers. It matters to a lot of other entities in the architecture.
Right, and when that voicemail system gets that call, you cryptographically know who attested it. It doesn't matter whether that certificate is good right now, whether that attestation is no longer good. You know who attested for it.
Eric, you do understand that if that's your model, so you know, Pinky 3 has an attestation that it owns some numbers and you don't care which ones. I trust it because it's signing it.
No, this is the issue, because we're talking about
here.
The issue is that they at one time did have it, because otherwise they couldn't sign for it.
No, Eric, you're completely missing the point. If all you care about is that Pinky 3 signed it.
No.
I
think this is where we are actually in the same place, but in a different place. We are talking about, this whole thing is about revocation. This whole thing.
It's about validity of the.
First part was about revocation of the cert.
I'm sorry, the cert
I'm talking about the revocation.
Okay.
Of course, guys, the number is the point. Guys,
We'll take this offline.
I think that you do need to have that conversation. Not at the mic.
I'm not arguing that, okay?
Ryan Rosen, and I don't want to talk about that. I did want to say that I really think that in many cases, the certificate will have a huge number of numbers that are not neatly arranged in ranges, and that I don't know, it's not clear to me that having the number range literally in the certificate is ever going to be useful. It might be, but since you've got to do the validation, I think, regardless of the previous discussion, I think that if you wanted to make it simple, that having an indirect, having the URL in the cert that gets you the range, gets you the numbers, or validates that a number is there, is what you want, and not to actually literally try to put the numbers in the cert.
Henning, my sense is that at least for consumer numbers, uninterrupted blocks are going to be really and increasingly rare. I mean, it's going to be onesies and twosies. Essentially, you're talking about enumeration, where adding ranges saves you 10% of storage space, but it's largely as if you enumerated every single number, whether you do that as a bit mask or you do it as a string is a separate issue. But you're almost, I don't think you're going to get a whole lot out of ranges. What I don't understand is, given that the numbers stay with a provider for some number of months on average, probably longer on that, just given what we know about porting characteristics, that what is the big advantage, except for, let's say, a large entity, let's say a university or a corporation which has 10,000 numbers, to have non-contiguous ranges in the certificate at all, given that you might as well just have, when you get a number ported to you, you create a certificate, you never touch it again until the customer leaves, and then you have a corporate customer which has a contiguous range, very simple in that. Why worry about having all these corner cases that in effect, if you want to do that, you're going to have a huge certificate just filled with numbers.
I think it depends on where because the people that are giving out these numbers can decide to put all of them, some of them, like we kind of designed to allow, flexibility in letting them decide how to do it, right? So it's like, you can look at this tree and put out little pieces, but we wanted to leave it up to the provider basically to say, I want 1 cert, I want 20 certs, and they can do however they want. Yeah. So it's for one guy who has one big block and then little chunks come out. We had to support that case, but then there's another one where the guy's like, well, I can carve my, or girl, can carve my tree up into like 6, and it's up to them. That's really why we do that.
Yeah, but if that comes at no cost in terms of testing and implementation overhead, I'm all in favor of that. Yeah. If it comes in terms of cost, that because you have the usual problem, everybody just codes over the examples that will appear eventually, then you have a problem that we'll code off the example, that will work. And your your relatively uncommon quote optimization will mysteriously fail in some cases, and that adds nothing.
My only hope is that we have really smart people, and we talk to people like Martin and John and other people, and they're kind of like, okay, we kind of know how to do this. And I think that the model of actually carving the trees out is actually kind of well understood in the CA kind of space. So people that know how to do this kind of hopefully won't get it wrong, but I do share your concern that people will just code up the examples and dork it up.
And I'd rather see, again, since unlike many other things where you have, sort of say, consenting adults into working with each other, we know one of the biggest cases of failures for call completion, rural call completion, besides some vague shenanigans that these cost routers do, is that it is simply mistakes of not updating things and just not quite, because it's a small carrier that can't quite, that didn't update the software or had some limited implementation. So one question is, if we know that the majority of things are essentially singletons or simple ranges, I think we can agree to that. We know that, because
if we do that, it makes it a lot easier then, because it gets, but I don't know that we can do that. So, yeah. I mean, and the other thing is, right, we are giving you the ability to blow your foot off, right? Right. So it's always the problem, and it scares us all, but I mean,
yeah,
we put warnings in. I'm sure you guys will have all kinds of literature about, beware.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the alternative is to some degree to letting people blow their foot off. I mean, we've talked about cases where a single, like a carrier, like a top 5 carrier might want to have a cert that would be valid for other numbers. Now, obviously, that cert is not going to contain as a literal in it all the discontinuous little ranges that they're valid for. It'll be something more like a by reference in either of these 2 forms. Both of these are really just by reference solutions you see up here, right? And that, what? You're shaking your head at me. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, I think we would just want to give the flexibility through mechanisms like this to really let people, if you want to have 5 certs that, are all identical, that have an identical scope of authority for your network, and that could potentially have millions of numbers in them, there are 5 instruments that behave that way, that layer of indirection that these options offer, we think is sufficient to permit that operationally. If you prefer to do things in much finer granularity like you described, that's an easy case too, right? I mean, it's more work, right, to keep those then updated. It's more work as things change. If you have these as literals in the cert, to then effectively revoke them and replace them.
Yeah.
The less we need to do that, the more that is by reference, the less we will need to do that. And that's what's led us to roughly this architecture.
And I'm also hoping that there will be some testing done before the stuff really goes live. I'm sure they're not like, oh,
we'll do this.
So
yeah,
we'll figure this.
All right. So Brian Rosen,
let me interject right quick.
2 real slides left, and so 10 minutes a slide.
That's exactly how much time you got left.
Okay. Since I think that the query for this certificate is the following number currently in scope is something that is absolutely required, listing the numbers in the certificate is not absolutely required. If you want to have it for some short circuit reason, make it really simple, because I don't want the shoot in the foot problem to be the guy that created the cert shoots the foot of the guy that receives it.
Yeah. Richard Barnes, it seems to me like the main interesting question here is, if you're going to have the by value type and the by reference type, what the relationship is between those 2. and maybe the answer to the simplest thing is like either you have a by value one or you have some reference, but there needs to, yeah, okay. All right. Yeah.
Do you have complicated things by reference, and because you don't want complicated things by size, reason, by value anyway, and do the really simple one-offs by value or contiguous ranges by value, whatever, however far you want to stretch it.
Yeah, we could. I mean, that just adds a little additional, that adds complexity. I want to qualify it to the verifier, right? Because you got to support both, because you don't know who's going to send you what. So choice, correct. So yeah, I mean, as long as people can accept that, okay. All right. Okay, next slide. So this, the option one is kind of, I'm calling it a piggyback option, right? So the idea is if we're going to be checking the verification of the cert, well, let's just do OCSP. And you know what? Hey, PKI guys love to extend things. So basically, you actually have an extension in the certificate, because that's where you find it, and then you can define your own OCSP, a value to put in certificate, and an OCSP extension. And the extension mechanism is really easy to find. It's an OI. We get it out of the IANA PKIX We know the expert is Russ Housley sitting in the front of the room. we would, set the criticality of the flag, and the syntax can be any damn thing we want. It can be the full block, just the one, whatever we want. So I probably would just be the one, right? Because you only care about that caller, and off it goes. It's small, it's good, and off we go. Right? I know Richard's frowning, and I, kind of looked at this and I was like, good, too, because there's some issues to be had.
I'm gonna let you finish, but yeah, I'm reminded of Phil's comment in Acme, read my lips, no new ASN1. No, my real concern here is, well, I'm not, having looked at a few OCSP responders recently, in the especially the pre-signed optimized implementation, not a whole, I would want to verify that people are paying attention to extensions and criticality, because I think a lot of them just ignore them.
Fair enough. I think that we're not just going to use these off the shelf. You're going to be spending some code to do some stuff. This is probably going to be a closed system. General web queries are not going to this bad boy.
Stuart Hogan. Isn't this a second form of authorization? If you're already including an extension in the certificate that identifies the authorized numbers,
well,
can't you just verify that?
Well,
Isn't that sufficient instead of having to do it again with OCSP?
So that depends on how many numbers you put in the cert, right? You put a huge range, you have to verify the thing that's signed, which only includes one number, is actually in that range to verify that they're authorized to do that, right? If you only have, if it's a one-to-one, then you can kind of get rid of this, and then you can do the by reference, which is the next option, yeah. So it's kind of a trade-off. So some issues, right? Well, not issues, it's good actually. We can do some pre-generated responses to save things. Now the cool thing is they have this thing called stapling, right? It's this OCSP stapling idea. It's about making queries to like websites faster. And so what you do when you set up the TLS connection, right, which is the security between the client and the server actually gives you the OCSP response to you, so you don't have to go look for it. So it would be really cool, however the connections, I haven't really thought about this as much, we have to put it out, but when you're verifying it, what connections are already there, and maybe there's some way, A, you can pre-generate the responses to make it faster, and B, actually give that response to the client when it's connecting to whatever. I don't know how that'll all work, but it might speed up things because I'm concerned about impact on call setup times. Right, so that's the first two, and then the high volume the CSP profile kind of prohibits the use of the single-use extensions. So that's a little bit of a wrinkle. So you're allowed, you can have there's two ways you can. So it's a sequence of requests. So you can have one or a bunch of requests, and then you can have an extension per single request, and then there's another one that goes on the outside, which would allow you to like the extension applies to all of them to make it smaller, but it prohibits it. I don't think that's a problem because again, I think we're gonna have one-offs here.
I mean, make our own OCSP profile.
Correct, right? And I'm not gonna worry about it. And I mean, well, there's luckily some CA guys in the room that can help us as well. So that's option one. And option two is by reference, right? So where do we put URIs and certs? Well, hey, lucky for us, the PKIX guys left us a bucket. It's called the authority info access extension. So what would you want to do? We need to have semantics behind this URI. It's not just go to this thing. So we could define our own. Hey, guess what? Luckily for us, it supports an OID and a general name, but I know none of you know what that is. So if we can actually pick what it is, and I assume we would pick the URI. So the idea is you would get this thing, and you would actually you could go directly to where the thing is, and then just have it be one thing. Obviously, the issue is obviously to add some latency while you do this query response thing.
And I just wanted to put in terms of the privacy concerns, if it's just like an HTTP URI, obviously it can challenge you and there can be like authorization and access controls. If a carrier who has, 57,000 numbers and this doesn't feel like sharing them all with you, they can reject your request if they don't like it.
I guess my general feeling is that I don't know that we're actually driving to pick one of these. So I think we just have to document them both up sufficiently, right? And then the client would we'd have to say, you kind of need to support both, or do you want to do a must and a should? I mean, I'm kind of looking for a little guidance here.
Now, the both here is by value or by reference is that the both or the, right? That's the question you're asking.
No.
Okay.
So go back to the 2 slides, 1, 2. There. So this is the first
right.
Piggyback.
Right. Okay. So I personally think option 1 is sufficient. I'm certainly willing to deal with option 2, but I don't think it's necessary. I think option 1 is sufficient. The only thing we're really trying to do is to validate a call. To validate a call, what you need is number 1.
All right, so let me get all...
And then an hour conversation that we had.
Yeah, so let me get all camel's nose under the tent on you here. Let's suppose that there's going to be a privileged class of verifiers who are going to want to basically subscribe to the feed of all the numbers that are available on the other side of this. I'd like to have the URI field we express into be flexible enough that it could be, I don't know if it's a web push, if it's a SIP subscribe or something like that, so that I can, again, if you imagine a consortium, if you are very large carriers and you just want to always know what the deltas are to these things over time, I could easily imagine an architecture like that. So it'll be for special use cases. Debugging is another, I think, valid case for this.
I disagree. I think that debugging is a poor example. There's plenty of ways to debug this thing without dumping the database. I think that your use case, which is maintain an authorized copy of the validation, would not be done using this mechanism. It would be done with some kind of database replication protocol, which we've done before. We know how to do things like that, and they don't look like this. You mean you'd have, in order to do what you want to do, you first have to get a list of complete list of certificates, and then get the numbers associated with each of those certificates. Don't do that.
I understand why you say it, but the point is that the URIs that actually point to the contents behind any particular cert, the place for that to live and for it to be secured would be in the cert itself. I don't think that that should be in some external source. I think it's a natural place for that to live. But again, I mean, is there a harm into, even if it is useless?
The harm is that everybody's going to implement both because you don't know what the sender will send.
Well,
you don't know what the verifier needs. Right.
Can I just ask a question about, have you thought anything about the trust semantics when dereferencing external things? Are you expecting the thing that you get in return to be, signed by something that shares a trust anchor with?
Richard Burns, I would expect the URLs to be required to be some secured protocol like HTTPS, so that you use transitively.
Transport, not object.
Yep.
Okay, definitely. Yeah, like we're not just taking it willy-nilly. That would be silly.
No, I understand that, but I was wondering whether it's object security or it's transport security. It has, for instance, consequences for caching.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is,
okay, are you sure about that?
Yeah, so the summary of all this stuff is, right, so the idea is right now we've got this really complicated way of putting a bunch of crazy things in the cert. If you're going to do that, you're going to end up doing like the option 1, right? If you end up doing just putting 1 in, you're going to do option 2, right? So if that's kind of a general summary of, I think, how you do it, I can write the draft up in such a way as to kind of give advice to implementers to kind of grasp that.
Again, I'll repeat my concern is we want to encourage early deployment. And so what I'd like to think about is, let's say we take a relatively more minimalist approach that covers our initial needs. Is there a way later on to get to a more sophisticated version that is reasonably backward compatible?
Sure, start sticking extensions.
Yeah, and so that it becomes an efficiency issue as opposed to a correctness issue. So that old implementation, which are more likely to be small in scale, because they only handle a few calls. So I don't know what the magic is, but I'm worried about more options, particularly with stuff that is somewhat opaque. I mean, most smaller entities that do that are not security experts. They probably have no idea what OCSP is to begin with. And so the smaller and narrower we can keep that without getting into just in case stuff, I would feel much more comfortable with that, simply because that will make the interoperability testing easier. It will make the deployment story easier. It will do all those things. And if we can get there later when we have a demonstrated need where it's just so inefficient to do something, we can get there later, but just do it for those who really care. That seems might have been the other piece that I think maybe I'm the only one confused, and then tell me to shut up, is we seem to be talking about 2 different things, and I don't know if that's clear in the draft, namely the revocation issues, or CSP and things like that, and what does this certificate apply to issues in that. They're coupled in some ways, but right now we seem to be talking about both of those almost simultaneously, and I'm not sure that helps the discussion.
So I mean, I could split it out, and I tried to in the draft. Obviously, just went out yesterday. It was like there's a CRL option, and then I'm trying to lead people down the garden path. If we're going to do this, then to check it the other way, you would do that, because it's like 2 parts of it, right?
Yeah. I actually have to say I'm fine if we just want to do 1 to start and say we'll do 2 later if it turns out it's useful.
So again, you know, I apologize because it got posted
simplicity
yesterday, and you guys are
people
just seeing it
happier.
now. I definitely do think we need to take it to the list, but unless somebody wants to jump up and scream for more complexity, which might or might not happen, you know.
But I do want to say that the conflation of the 2 properties that you were just.
I'm not understanding what you meant.
I'm sorry, I said.
So you said you're fine if we do 1. Do you mean either of these, or
No, I meant,
number 1?
I'm sorry, that we do number 1. Sorry, yes. We do number 1, and that we will do number 2. When I say it that way, it sounds even worse. It is too late in the week to be having this discussion. Yes, option 1 and option 2. But I wanted to say that the conflation of those 2 properties in option 1 is intentional. Actually, I really think it is. In the sense of, if we're really imagining that the common use case isn't going to be that there's a cert that's valid for a single number, but it's going to be valid for multiple numbers. Yeah, I think finding out whether or not a number is in the scope of authority of the cert and validating that the cert is both valid and valid for that number at this particular moment, we want those to be conflated. That is a design property of this. So I don't want them disentangled. As I'd say, I actually want those to remain entangled. I think we need both. We need them together.
Yeah, I mean, so that seems to sort of lead toward the OCSP extension thing as the baseline acceptable thing, and then maybe doing this AIA thing a little bit later. If we need it.
I mean, ideally, I don't want to add these round trips, right? I just kind of want things to magically happen. You're subscribing to something, and you know if the search revoked. Because I mean, as we know at Acme, right, revocation sucks, right? It's hard. They don't want to do it on the web. They're trying to figure out all kinds of ways to get around checking it, right? So we are gonna experience some of the same pain. So we want to figure out how to minimize that pain.
It does, however, kind of raised the question of what a stapling thing for this might look like if we're relying on request extensions.
Right, so that's the whole thing
Okay.
is when you get the thing, I haven't actually thought out like what are you connected to and when would you do it and how do you know the information to ask for and all that stuff.
I mean, it somewhat seems obvious to me in the sense of you're going to get a URL in the signaling, which is nominally how you get the cert, right? And fetching the cert is the trigger for the staple, I think, if you are going to fetch it from the guy who is the signer.
Okay. So I think we're now down into being on the actual mechanism, which is.
Yeah, so fine. So I mean, at this point, the draft kind of like lays out some things, and really kind of the open issue is really this kind of revocation thing, and then how far down the rabbit hole of profiling the certs do you want to go? Because right now it just says certs, right? And we have the SIP certs draft, which kind of explains how you do the, the notify request thing to figure out, to get the cert, to get enrolled and that kind of stuff, but it doesn't actually lay out what exactly needs to be in these things. And there's a ton of fields, and the problem with PKI obviously is that people shoot themselves in the foot by putting all kinds of extra junk in there that we don't need. And having done this for a while, I think I can help you not put junk in there you don't need. And so the idea is that we can profile a bunch of things and we can be really strict about how we profile those and say if there's anything else, fail miserably, right? That's what some of the routing guys did. I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's what they did. And the other option is to say, here are the base things that you're required to have, which is like 1 or 2 things more than is in the base certificate profile that's in PKIX. And then say you can put anything else you want in there, and then that's up to the service providers to not shoot themselves in the foot.
Informed by the high volume thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there's 2 parts. One, you'd have to profile the certs, right? And then if you're going to do OCSP, we'd actually have to update the OCSP profile. And those, I mean, honestly, I can pump that stuff out in my sleep. So it's, once we decide what to do, I could figure out how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. Because I mean, again, like we haven't picked a signature algorithm and all that kind of stuff. And my assumption is we're going to do elliptic curve because we want it to be, the certs need to be small and it needs to be fast and all that good stuff. So basically that's it for me. So
Okay, so a little bit of putting you and the rest of the working group on the spot in the 5 or so minutes we have left. You just described the open work that you've already put hooks for into the document. Are there any other known dragons beyond the ones you've already identified?
I mean, there's still some TBDs in there, but I think a lot of them kind of got captured. So it's kind of like, how far down you? Yeah, I think we understand the landscape. We just have to make sure we don't step on landmines.
Are you going to be available to drive the conversation on these before, when we're sitting in Prague?
Yes, yeah, fair enough. That's a kick in the butt for Sean.
Yeah, so apologize for that.
No,
So
fine, I deserve it.
4474 is essentially baked. We've got these things that we need to do with the search draft, but we know roughly how big they are based on some of the decisions we've got to go. We've got an examples document that we want to crank out to go up with these things. Are there any questions that this group needed to answer that we haven't started working on answering yet?
And you said there's an example draft?
That Cullen and I, we don't have it yet.
Okay, sorry.
Ooh, I am the ghost of out of band. Ooh. Is the day of judgment at hand? Ooh.
Fair enough. So out of band was something we haven't done anything that's going to make out of band not happen. The out of band draft that's out there, what more work do we need to put into it?
Yeah. Well,
some.
Oh, I mean, we can talk about that if you want.
Yeah.
Brian Rosen, I hope that we actually create a document once we have finished this document that I'll tell you what I want to do, and we may not actually do it this way, but I want to give advice to national regulators about how to set up the CA for a given country.
So we've done some things like that in Cider where they wrote a CP and they have like a draft CPS and the whole 9 yards. So you could do that, give them a template and say, if you're going to do it, this is kind of how we think you ought to do it. Oh, technical more than just that policy stuff. All right, fair enough. I mean,
So Colin James, I was going to comment on the out of band. I mean, we've been implementing bits and pieces of that and plan to do a draft at some point in time, but nothing here has seemed like it was going to make that harder or anything like that. There was no issues to be raised. It's all looked good to be proceeding this along as quickly as we can. When it gets done, we can do the out of band stuff.
Well, so let me push on that quickly as we can thing again, right? You know, given modulo availability is some of the folks that can drive the task. I mean, is there anything that do we think that the conversations around what remains are of such magnitude that there is no hope that we can't be starting to talk about last calling drafts by the time we're in Prague? Like all of them.
You know, like when I send this
If anybody responds to email between now and Prague, we should be easily done, right? But if no one reads the list between now and then, we won't be. I mean, that's pretty much the summary of the situation, right?
Yeah, if I'm sending out technical stuff on PKI, I just want to make sure that people actually read it and give me a, yeah, that sounds good, as opposed to silence's approval.
Richard will read it for us.
He's got free time now. He's no longer an AD.
We have a picture of what.
Right. So, I mean, if we're not making progress, I would suggest that we have a slight, interim phone call or meeting or something, some forcing function to drive it. But we should, we're close.
For the people that, have been just monitoring loosely, wondering, when they should start really paying attention, well, it was a little while ago, but it's very definitely now. All right. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Maureen Mahoney. I just want to take a minute before this ends to thank all of you for your work on behalf of consumers. It makes a real difference in their lives, and you guys are awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right. We're adjourned.
I'll take Bluetooth.
That work for you? Got everything you need? I should have known right off the top of my head, because he's actually a buddy of mine. It just didn't come to me. I just thought, what do you mean?